She thought she was in control. She thought she was just doing her job. But when Officer Megan Hartley strikes a black driver during what should have been a routine stop, she learns, too late, that assumptions can unravel everything. The night had been calm, the kind of shift Officer Megan Hartley didn't mind. It was just past 10 p.m. in the quieter part of Columbus, where traffic had thinned to a trickle. She sat in her cruiser, parked near an empty lot, the soft hum of the streetlights above the only constant noise. She watched as occasional cars rolled by. Nothing unusual, until she noticed it, a sleek black sedan gliding through the intersection ahead. It was one of those high-end models that seemed designed for the driveway of a Fortune 500 CEO. Everything about it seemed in order, except for one minor detail. The driver hadn't used a turn signal. Technically a violation. Minor, sure, but a violation nonetheless. And maybe, just maybe, Megan felt like making sure people remembered that rules were still rules. She pulled onto the street, accelerating just enough to close the gap. A flick of her lights. The sedan's brake lights flared, and it eased smoothly to the curb. Megan stepped out deliberately, one hand resting on her belt, the other adjusting her radio. The quiet of the street stretched around her as she approached the driver's side. The window rolled down slowly, almost deliberately, revealing a black man in his mid-40s. He had a neatly trimmed beard, wore a tailored navy suit, and exuded the calm confidence of someone who belonged in a car like this. His hands were steady on the steering wheel, his fingers barely twitching as he glanced at her. Megan felt something coil in her chest. She didn't like the look in his eyes. There was no nervousness, no apology, just patience. Waiting. License and registration, she said, her voice firmer than it needed to be. The man blinked once, then slowly reached for his glove compartment, his movements controlled, as if he already knew what she was thinking. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" His voice was smooth, respectful, but it grated on her nerves. "Failed to signal a turn back there," she replied curtly. A beat passed. "Did I?" he asked, his tone calm, but edged with something else, something that felt like a challenge. "License and registration," she repeated, more clipped now. He handed them over without a word, his hands steady. Megan barely skimmed his ID before focusing back on him. Something about his composure irked her. "You live around here?" she asked. The man exhaled softly through his nose, more a breath than a sigh, but it felt like a statement. "I don't see how that's relevant." Her grip on his ID tightened. She'd been on the force over a decade, long enough to know when someone wasn't taking her seriously, long enough to know when someone thought they could outplay her. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered. For the first time, his expression shifted. His jaw set, his head tilted slightly. "Why? I asked you to step out," Megan said, her tone leaving no room for argument. He sighed, unbuckled his seatbelt, and opened the door. As he stood, Megan instinctively took a step back. He was taller than she'd expected, broad-shouldered, but his stance was relaxed. No aggression, no tension. Still, her pulse ticked up. "Hands on the trunk," she directed. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second before turning and placing his palms flat against the car. Megan's heart pounded. This was the moment, the shift in power. She pressed a hand against his back, guiding him down slightly. He stiffened, and that was when something inside her snapped. Before she could process it, her palm struck his cheek. The crack echoed in the empty street. His head jerked to the side. Then stillness, heavy, suffocating. Megan's breath hitched. What had she just done? The man slowly turned his head back toward her, his face unreadable. He didn't shout, didn't move, just stared. Then, in a steady, deliberate motion, he reached into his inner jacket pocket. Megan's stomach twisted. He pulled out his ID and held it up. "Marcus Bennett," she read aloud. Her eyes dropped to the title beneath his name. Chief of Police. Her throat dried up. Her pulse roared in her ears. She just struck her boss. Marcus Bennett's expression didn't change. He wasn't angry. He wasn't flustered. He was just watching her. "Chief Bennett, she stammered, but the words died in her throat. There was no good way to fix this. Another voice broke the silence. Everything okay here, Officer Hartley? Megan turned sharply. Another patrol car had pulled up behind hers. Officer Jamal Reeves, her regular partner, stood a few feet away, brows furrowed in confusion. She opened her mouth, but Marcus spoke first. "Everything's fine," he said smoothly, slipping his ID back into his pocket. "Your officer was just conducting a stop." Reeves blinked. "Sir, am I free to go?" Marcus asked, his eyes back on Megan. Her mouth was dry. This was at the moment. Marcus chuckled lowly, the sound devoid of humor. "Officer Hartley, are you detaining me?" The weight of Reeves' stare burned into her now, confusion turning into concern. "No, sir," she forced out. Marcus nodded once, calm and collected. Good to see the department still has some professionals. And with that, he walked back to his car, got in, and drove off into the night. But the moment the sedan disappeared, Reeves turned to her. "Megan, what the hell was that?" She clenched her jaw. "It was just a stop." "Just a stop? You look like you saw a ghost." "Nothing happened," she muttered, though her pulse was still racing. Reeves didn't look convinced, but didn't push. "I'll finish the report." "You good?" Megan nodded stiffly, but her hands were trembling as she reached for her cruiser door. That night, sleep evaded her. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment. The slap, the ID, Marcus Bennett's expressionless face. No threats, no yelling, just silence. Heavy, damning silence. Her phone buzzed just after sunrise. A single message, report to the chief's office. Internal Affairs has been notified. Her heart sank. The walls of the precinct felt closer than ever as she walked in. Whispers followed her, quick glances exchanged between officers. Word always got around. Upstairs, in the chief's office, Marcus Bennett sat behind his desk. Beside him stood Captain Lorraine Fields, her arms crossed, face a mask of neutrality. "Officer Hartley," Marcus greeted, voice steady. "Seat." Megan obeyed, legs stiff. Marcus leaned forward, hands clasped. "Walk me through last night's stop." She cleared her throat. Routine stop for failure to signal. He nodded once. And then, I asked for ID. The driver was, she hesitated, uncooperative. Marcus's brow quirked. Uncooperative how? He questioned why he was being stopped. Did he refuse to comply? Captain Fields cut in. Megan swallowed. "No, ma'am." "Did he threaten you?" "No." "Then why did you escalate to force?" The question sat in the air, heavy and sharp. Megan opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. I don't know." Marcus's jaw tensed. "That's not good enough." Silence wrapped around them until he finally slid a paper across the desk. "Effective immediately, you're placed on administrative leave, pending investigation." And Megan, this isn't over. She took the paper, fingers numb. Days blurred together after that. The precinct didn't call. Her friends didn't text. Her house felt too quiet. And the worst part? She couldn't shake his words. "You assumed I was a threat." The reflection hurt more than the punishment. When the call finally came, Internal Affairs, the meeting was brief but brutal. Megan didn't try to defend herself. She admitted it all. 60-day suspension. Mandatory bias training, Harris from IA concluded. It could have been worse. It should have been worse. But the shame lingered longer than the consequences. When she walked into her first bias training session, the room was filled with a dozen other officers. Some looked pissed to be there. Others were numb. The instructor, Detective Joanna Pierce, a black woman who'd spent 30 years on the force, clicked on a body cam video. It showed a stop gone wrong. An officer escalating, a black man staying calm. The officer lashed out anyway. Joanna faced the room. What did that cop see when he pulled this man over? Silence. Then she zeroed in on Megan. "What did you see that night?" Megan's throat dried. "A threat," she whispered. "Was he?" "No." "Then ask yourself, why did you think he was?" The question stuck with her long after the session ended. It was months before she walked back into the precinct. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. Marcus Bennett passed by. For a second, she thought he wouldn't say anything. But then at the door to his office, he paused. "Hartley." She straightened. "Sir." He nodded. "Welcome back." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start.